Iran is the #1 terrorist sponsoring nation in the Middle East and has been for more than 3 decades. After it gained control of the Gaza Strip in 2007 through Hamas, Tehran then set its sights on cementing control of Lebanon. That has now happened.
The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. During his second inaugural address in January 2005, George W. Bush said the best hope for peace in our world is the expansion of freedom in all the world. If this were true, then any popular uprising against oppression would be a movement toward peace, and thus in the best interests of America and the rest of the world. Unfortunately, this is not true, not in the world today. Lebanon is a perfect case in point. Within months of his second inaugural, when President Bush further amplified his democracy doctrine, the Lebanese people rose against their government and ousted pro-Syrian forces. It was a huge victory for democracy, the West immediately assumed. But within days, the real story materialized as these anti-Syria rallies were trumped by much larger pro-Syria demonstrations mounted by Hezbollah. At the time, the Iranian-sponsored Party of God was the best organized, most heavily armed terrorist group in the world. Prior to the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon, Hezbollah had claimed a number of victories on the battlefield. In October 1983, for example, Hezbollah rammed a truck packed with explosives into the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, killing 241 Americans. 4 months later, President Reagan withdrew all U.S. troops. In May 2000, a 15-year terror campaign to force Israel out of southern Lebanon ended in another victory for Hezbollah. In January 2004, a bloody suicide bombing and a political kidnapping convinced Israel to release 23 Lebanese terrorists and more than 400 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for the kidnapped Israeli and the remains of 3 others. So when Syrian forces left Lebanon in 2005, it was hardly the beginning of a new birth of freedom for the little nation north of Israel. It simply gave Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's leader, an opportunity to show the world just how powerful and how entrenched within Lebanon his organization really was. Nasrallah gave the word and instantaneously mobilized a mob of close to 500,000 into the streets in counter-protest. Notice what we wrote in May of 2005. This was in the Trumpet magazine. We said, there is no arguing that Hezbollah would be a major force if Lebanon held free elections. We said the bottom line is supporting democracy in Lebanon means accepting the probability of Hezbollah's rise. Likewise, democracy for the Palestinians will legitimize Hamas. Democracy in Egypt would empower the Muslim Brotherhood, and so on. Now, we wrote that in 2005, and today, Hamas now speaks for the Palestinian people. The Muslim Brotherhood is calling the shots in Egypt, and Hezbollah is in total control of Lebanon. During a recent trip to the little nation of Israel, our television crew stopped in the little Israeli town of Metula, just outside of Lebanon. From this location, overlooking the southern hills of Lebanon, we filmed a short segment for today's program on the rise of Lebanon. Today we're filming this program in the little town of Metula, located in the northernmost region of Israel, right next to its border with Lebanon. In fact, if you look at the fields behind me, you're actually looking at Lebanon. And while those fields right along the border are empty, The hills just beyond those fields are teeming with terrorist camps belonging to Hezbollah, the radical wing of Iran that now controls Israel's neighbor to the north. Right now, Hezbollah has more than 40,000 missiles positioned in those southern hills, and they're all pointed right here at Israel. 1 million Israeli citizens are within range of Hezbollah's short-range missiles. And since the Second Lebanon War a few years ago, Syria and Iran have been expanding Hezbollah's arsenal to include longer-range Scud missiles. A new reality has dawned, said one intelligence document seen by the Times of London in recent months. This is the first time that a terror organization has obtained a missile of this type, which is considered strategic. In the past, this type of missile has been held only by national armies. Only by national armies. What this means, really, is that every square inch of Israel, including the heavily populated cities down to our south, in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, all of those cities are now well within range of Hezbollah's rockets. And with Hezbollah now running Lebanon's government in Beirut, and with Syria in turmoil, it's only going to get worse for Israel. I want for you to think about what has happened here in this region in just the last few years. It wasn't that long ago, a little over 6 years now, that Lebanon was being hailed as a major success story in America's quest to usher in democracy to the Arab world. Following the assassination of Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri in February 2005, the Lebanese people rose up in rebellion against their Syrian overlords, demanding the end of Syria's 30-year military occupation of Lebanon. Within a few months, Lebanon's Cedar Revolution had successfully ousted Syrian troops from Lebanon, dissolved the pro-Syrian government in Beirut, and paved the way for the creation of an independent, democratically elected Lebanese government. Following the ouster of Syria, Lebanon, with enthusiastic support from the United States, conducted its first parliamentary elections in 33 years. Now that happened in June of 2005, just 6 years ago. And what a victory it was for democracy, we thought. With the influence of Iran and Syria diminished, a Lebanon democracy would surely be friendly to Israel and a Western ally in this always volatile region, right? Well, actually, Hezbollah started claiming victories at the ballot box from the beginning. It didn't quite have the majority in June 2005, but those initial elections gave it legitimacy. Thanks to democracy, Iran and Syria now had political soldiers operating inside Lebanon's newly formed government. Hezbollah immediately set out to expand its newfound political agenda, which meant ensuring that Lebanon's new government distanced itself from Israel, America, and the West. It also meant making sure the newly liberated nation re-established a close working relationship with Syria. Then, a year later, in July 2006, Hezbollah invaded Israel, not just with a barrage of rockets. They actually cut through the fence along the border, not very far from here, and entered into Israel, just a few miles, really, a few miles west of here, and ambushed 2 Israeli Humvees, killing 8 soldiers and taking 2 others hostage. This was not a random terrorist act. It was an audacious declaration of war against Israel by the strongest military force in its northern neighbor. Israel reacted in self-defense just as any other nation would have after being invaded. And the war that followed lasted for 34 days and ended with Israel and Hezbollah agreeing to terms laid out by the United Nations Security Council in UN Resolution 1701. Now that resolution called for the disarmament of Hezbollah, for the withdrawal of Israel from southern Lebanon, and for the deployment of Lebanese soldiers and a United Nations interim force to police the southern region behind me. The reality, however, is that once Israel withdrew, Hezbollah rearmed, increased its strength many times over. in Beirut. To continue on from 2006, between 2006 and 2008, there was gridlock in the Lebanese government as pro-Hezbollah and Western-friendly political parties jostled for influence and control over the country. And then in May 2008, Lebanon's pro-West prime minister attempted to gain the upper hand by severing Hezbollah's relationship with Iran. That move, in the end, backfired in spectacular fashion as Hezbollah forces took to the streets and simply imposed their will on the government in a matter of hours. The situation finally calmed down when Hezbollah agreed to participate in peace talks with Lebanon's leaders at Doha, and the two groups appeared to have reached a compromise. But as has been proven over and over again, a compromise for pro-Western forces always turns out to be a decisive victory for the forces of terror. At Doha, Hezbollah secured decisive influence over Lebanon's government, even to the point of being able to handpick Lebanon's president. Incredibly, President Bush said at the time, "I'm hopeful the Doha Agreement will usher in an era of political reconciliation to the benefit of all Lebanese." A year later, in June 2009, the pro-Western governing majority in Lebanon appeared to weather a strong challenge from the Hezbollah-led opposition. The New York Times said at that time, "The results represent a significant and unexpected defeat for Hezbollah and its allies, Iran and Syria." Fox News said the election results were a stunning setback to the Iranian-backed militants. But as Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah said prior to those parliamentary elections, they had no intention of taking over leadership of the country at that time. Politically, Hezbollah was positioned exactly where it wanted to be. It had plenty of power and influence within Lebanon's government, but without the heavy burden of running its day-to-day operations. Meanwhile, in December 2009, Lebanon's cabinet agreed that Hezbollah had the right to keep its weapons. That from Lebanon's cabinet. In October then of 2010, just last year, Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad made a visit to Lebanon, where he was greeted with terrific fanfare. His visit culminated in a large rally held at a Hezbollah stronghold right near this Israeli border. Then, in January 2011, Hezbollah finally brought down Lebanon's coalition government by pulling its cabinet members out of the unity government in protest against the investigation into the 2005 assassination of the former prime minister. Now, after that, finally, the Western press fessed up to what was really happening in this nation. The New York Times wrote that the collapse of Lebanon's government signaled the final stage in Hezbollah's rise from resistance group to ruling power. It continued, while Hezbollah technically remains the head of the political opposition in Beirut, make no mistake, the Party of God has fully consolidated its control in Lebanon and will stop at nothing, including civil war, to protect its position. Let me read that last bit one more time. The Party of God has fully consolidated its control in Lebanon and will stop at nothing, including civil war, to protect its position. Hezbollah's actions, the Times also noted, highlighted America's limited influence in Lebanon. How about that? Astoundingly, it was actually the Doha peace agreement, which was supported by President Bush and the West, that enabled Hezbollah to bring down the government. The New York Times explained, Washington lent strong rhetorical support to the Hariri coalition when it came first to power in 2005, but was unable to stop Hezbollah's troops and their supporters from taking over the streets of Beirut and forcibly acquiring veto power over the government by gaining the blocking third, 10 of the cabinet's 30 ministerial seats. It was Hezbollah's exercising of that power, with the resignation of the 10 opposition ministers, along with one independent, that toppled the government this week. That's coming from, as I said, the New York Times. Now, why is it whenever the United States helps negotiate peace, it ends up benefiting the forces of terror the most. What an upside-down world we're living in. In June of this year, when Hezbollah's new government was announced, guess which party was now in the majority? The so-called Party of God now controls all aspects of Lebanese affairs. Its military, telecommunications networks, international borders, airports, seaports, you name it. And all this time, while Hezbollah has been rising in ranks politically over the last 6 years, it's tripled its military strength. Hezbollah's rocket arsenal is now 3 times larger than what it had during the war with Israel in 2006. 3 times! And added to that, it now has these Scud missiles capable of reaching any city in Israel. As Jerusalem Post columnist Carolyn Glick recently noted, the current U.S. administration is now pushing a policy that drastically escalates the chance that a new war between Israel and Iran's Lebanese army will break out again in the near future. In May, U.S. official John Brennan met with Lebanese leaders and commented on Hezbollah's supposed evolution from a purely terrorist organization to a militia to an organization that now has members within the parliament and the cabinet. He then talked about trying to diminish the more radical influence in the party and instead try to build up the more moderate elements. But as Carolyn Glick notes in that article I just quoted, she said the Obama administration's notion that the U.S. can adopt a nuanced approach to the terror group is put paid or undermined by Hezbollah's takeover of the Lebanese government, its growing capabilities in the Western Hemisphere, its continued devotion to the cause of Israel's destruction, its participation in the killing of Syrian anti-regime protesters, and Iran's clear control over all aspects of the organization's operations. And yet, by all accounts, the administration refuses to acknowledge that there can be no nuance toward Hezbollah. No nuance. Let's look at Leviticus 26 if you want to turn over there. We'll just hit a couple of scriptures here before we conclude. In all of these developments I just discussed with you, we clearly see numerous Bible prophecies being fulfilled. Without question, the power and the influence of the King of the South, headed by Iran, is spreading. It's gaining momentum everywhere that you turn here in the Middle East. It's advancing. Its forces are advancing. Its proxies are advancing. We see the forces of terror backing Israel now into a corner. I mean, Israel, as I said at the start, has 40,000 rockets aimed at it right now. 40,000 rockets. And that's just from Lebanon. We haven't even considered in this program Hamas or the radicalization of Egypt or Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons. And then there's America. These terrorist victories certainly highlight America's rapid decline, not just in the region, but around the world, but certainly so in this region. And notice what it says in Leviticus 26 and verse 19. God says, I will break the pride of your power, and I will make your heaven as iron, and your earth as brass, and your strength shall be spent in vain, for your land shall not yield her increase, neither shall the trees of the land yield their fruits. America still has power and strength, even though that too is being diminished, but the pride in that power has long been broken. This is a point we've brought out frequently at thetrumpet.com on the Key of David. Mr. Armstrong wrote about this in the United States and Britain in Prophecy. The pride in that power has been broken long ago, and what little strength is left, what little strength is there, is being spent in vain, just as God said that it would be. The U.S. has been heavily invested in Lebanon's push for democracy since the Cedar Revolution of 2005. At that time, we trumpeted the revolution as being a symbol of the Middle East future, as a symbol of freedom and democracy, sweeping across a supposedly safer and more secure Middle East. America's funneled more than $1 billion into Lebanon since 2005. Added to that, since 2001, America has been just pouring billions of dollars, billions upon billions of dollars into the Middle East and trillions now, if you take into account all of the war efforts that the U.S. has been involved in since 9/11. And think now for a moment, what does the United States have to show for it? All of this money that we've spent, all of these lives that we've given up, all of these policies that we've pushed, what do we have to show for it? If you look at what's happening in the Middle East, if your eyes are open to what's going on in the news, you can see that it's Iran who's gaining the victories in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, Egypt, Gaza, Lebanon. Notice Daniel 11. This too is a prophecy we've referred to frequently at thetrumpet.com. Daniel chapter 11, where it talks about this great clash between two powers, two world powers in this end time. And the exciting thing about all of this, really, as depressing as it could be just looking at the facts on the surface, I mean 40,000 missiles aiming right at this country, but as exciting, it's also exciting in the sense that everything is happening just the way God said it would happen. These last few verses in Daniel 11, for instance, just spell it out in great detail. They actually tell us when World War III will start, who will start it, and they tell us how it will end. Look at Daniel 11 and verse 40. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. So the Bible says two kings will clash in this end time. God wants you to understand this. He wants us to know who these people are, who these kings are. God gave us these prophecies to understand them. He didn't record them in vain. This is important because this is the beginning of World War III. That's what Daniel's describing here. And you can see from the last part of Daniel, Daniel 12, he didn't know what he was writing. He didn't understand what he was writing about. That's because it was for our day. It's for today. This is where it all starts, this clash between these two world powers. God says there's going to be a clash in this end time between the kings of the north and south. These are the same two forces that were pitted against one another during the Great Crusades. Catholic Europe, Catholic-dominated Europe, and radical Islam. History, in other words, is repeating itself. It's replaying right before our eyes. Even today, commentators might now admit that Hezbollah's gains put Israel in grave danger of yet another war with Lebanon, and that certainly is a possibility. But what those same commentators don't see is that the rise of radical Islam will soon push the United States right out of the Middle East and then push right up against a united Europe, which is what triggers this prophesied clash. Daniel prophesied about the end-time rise of a regional superpower in the Middle East, and now we see it happening before our eyes. Iran now holds all the cards in Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and Lebanon. Where will it move next? Where will it make gains next? Well, you can get a pretty good idea if you just look at a map, if you see where it's already advanced. What's left? My father got into this a couple years back at thetrumpet.com, writing in August 2008. This is actually from the Trumpet magazine. It also appears on the website. But now that it has Lebanon, he wrote, talking about Iran, he said Iran undoubtedly will go after the West Bank. In Daniel's prophecy, God says that the king of the south will push or provoke war with the king of the north. Iran, even now, it possesses a provocative foreign policy. But the way we expect Iran to provoke war with this German-led European power is by capturing Jerusalem. This is the point that my father made in that same article. Notice what he wrote. He said that push will undoubtedly revolve around Jerusalem, which remains a focal point of Catholicism and is rapidly being besieged by radical Islamic forces led by Iran. Conquering Jerusalem has been Iran's openly stated goal for some time. But can you imagine what will happen to the Arab world when it takes control of East Jerusalem, including its third holiest site? That's what my father wrote 3 years ago. In that same article, he said, Iran has taken over Gaza and Lebanon, and soon it will get control of the West Bank. That's quite a statement. But look at what we've been saying since the early 1990s regarding the rise of Islam, regarding the rise of Iran. Go back to thetrumpet.com and see what we've been saying, and then take note of where we're headed and keep your eyes on the news. Watch world events, as Jesus said, so that you can know where we are in Bible prophecy. He said it will soon lead to control of the West Bank, and then it will turn its attention toward the ultimate prize, which is to capture Jerusalem. So Bible prophecy says that these end-time events, the rise of the King of the South, its clash with the King of the North, Christ's great battle with the armies of mankind who gather around Megiddo, all of this centers around Jerusalem. Later on in our tour here in Israel with the Trumpet Daily, we'll be taping some programs right in Jerusalem. So make sure that you stay tuned to the Trumpet Daily to understand the real meaning behind the news, to know where we are in the prophetic flow of world events. You can always go to thetrumpet.com, as we've said so many times before, to keep abreast of what's happening in this world. In the news, you see a lot of reporting of the news, but you see so little understanding of where it's headed, of where it's leading. That's what thetrumpet.com specializes in. Now, added to that, for this program, as we've said before, you can go to thetrumpetdaily.com to see all of these programs again in their entirety if you'd like to review any of them. So we'll look forward to seeing you again on the program next time, perhaps as we tour through some other places to film here in the little nation of Israel. And until we see you again, this is Stephen Fleury reporting to you from northern Israel, right next to the Lebanese border. To continue your study, go to the phone now and call the toll-free number on your screen and ask for the King of the South. As you learned on the program today, Daniel 11 speaks of two mighty kings that will soon clash in these latter days. God says there will be a clash in this end time between the kings of the north and south. This 54-page booklet tells you everything you need to know about one of those kings, the King of the South. We first started writing about the emergence of this king back in the early 1990s, nearly 20 years ago. This booklet pretty much lays it all out there for you to see. All the key events leading right into the prophesied Great Tribulation and then the return of Jesus Christ to this earth. Call the number on your screen now and we'll send you a free copy of this booklet, The King of the South. Now we'll also include a transcript of today's program titled The Rise of Lebanon. Of course, you can also view today's program in its entirety at thetrumpetdaily.com. But you can download both of these, the booklet and the transcript or the PDF that we've made available right now if you go to thetrumpetdaily.com and look for the publications in the upper right-hand corner. That's all we have time for today. We thank you for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next time.